My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the Executive Director for EU Policy at the European Climate Foundation. The goal of the ECF is to support the necessary transition to a zero-carbon economy and to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees of pre-industrial temperatures, ideally 1.5. What does it take to achieve that? Climate warming emissions must peak as soon as possible, and after that, they must be rapidly reduced. According to the IPCC, CO2 emissions must reach net zero by around 2050. The difference that the Paris Agreement makes is that by putting the focus on well below 2 degrees, that makes it very clear that all sectors have to contribute. So what does it take from the energy system? Quite simply, we need to move beyond combustion. We need to shift from a world in which fossil fuels provide much of the baseload to one where clean renewables are providing the baseload. Clean energy starts with phasing out coal as soon as possible. The OECD says that that will need to have happened by 2030 in developed countries. The challenge, therefore, is how to move from coal to clean. Achieving that is firstly about increasing investment in wind and solar. The recent decline in investment in that area is a cause for concern, and investment will need to double in the coming years. Secondly, it's about avoiding overinvestment in gas assets. There are other ways to provide flexibility. We must also bear in mind that we can't achieve our renewables goals by simply switching from coal to biomass, tempting though that may be. There is a limited bioresource that is sustainable, with competition from many sectors. Some of the most compelling calls come from the aviation sector, from heavy industry, and therefore there will be tough competition. And this must be borne in mind in the energy sector. What is more is the volume of energy that's required by the power sector and for domestic heating is far greater than can be provided by the sustainably available resource. However, looking at the national and energy climate plans, the future dependence on bioenergy goes far beyond what can be mobilized sustainably. We'll need to focus keenly on those resources that are lowest in carbon intensity and can be mobilized most sustainably, such as wastes and residues. And we'll need to be wise about the way in which those resources are allocated. Thirdly, coal to clean also means flexibility. Happily, there are other ways to balance an electricity system than using thermal resources. The European Climate Foundation's vision rests upon three main pillars: efficiency to lower the overall demand, zero carbon renewables, and increased electrification wherever possible, which also helps provide flexibility to the system. Electrification is already underway. In the first quarter of this year, we saw electric vehicle sales in Europe rise above 100,000 for the first time. Volkswagen is investing billions in repurposing its factories for producing electric cars. It is clear that the transition to e-mobility is happening, and it is happening much sooner than many of us anticipated. Clearly, electrification could also start to play a greater role in the home. For example, in the Netherlands, they're already discussing a gas phase-out, and that kind of discussion is also taking place in the UK. And here in Brussels, we see the beginning of a renewed debate on how to decarbonize heavy industry. That transition will involve electrification, either directly or indirectly via hydrogen. We at the ECF acknowledge that there will be many challenges to overcome on the road ahead. It will be important to ensure that cars, buildings, and industrial processes are integrated in a way that is as smart as possible. At the same time, we'll need to ensure the costs of the transition are fairly distributed and that nobody faces a disproportionate burden. So what does that pathway look like? We're delighted to be joined today by experts from the energy sector, from transport, from industry, and from the European Commission. I look forward to hearing their vision on EU pathways to the decarbonisation of energy. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Dries Acker, who will moderate the session.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dries Acker, also working with the European Climate Foundation. This is nevertheless not really a European Climate Foundation event, but actually an event from Iberdrola and Smartn, but we were kindly invited to help them with this event. I'm going to moderate the first session. So if I may ask the following panelists to come to the forefront. Mrs. Megan Richards, Director for Energy Policy at the European Commission. Please, if you want to take a seat. Mr. William Tots, Director at Transport and Environment. If you can come to the stage. Mr. Gonzalo Sainz de Miera, Director of Climate Policy for Iberdrola. And then Mr. Martin Porter, Executive Chair at the Brussels office at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. And yeah, that's the whole lot. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Very pleased to have an expert panel. The question of today is, how can we reach a net zero emissions Europe? I'm very happy to be here as a moderator, so I don't need to answer that question. So that burden will be upon you. And if I may, we only have a half an hour, so relatively short. So I will introduce each of the speakers with a pointed question, and you can take a couple of minutes to answer that. Afterwards, we'll try to moderate the conversation. And then in the last 10 minutes, I will open the floor to the many people in this room, actually. So please already think about your key question that you want to pose later, because I will give you that opportunity. Let me start with Mrs. Richards from the European Commission. The European Union has just adopted a big clean energy package to 2030, targets and policies for that. What is your general take? Are these sufficient to put Europe on a path to net zero by 2050? Or do you see gaps in the pathway that still need attention from European policymakers in the next years?
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a very interesting topic, of course. I think that the Clean Energy Package of legislation is an excellent base from which we can develop a 2050 strategy. It's not sufficient to reach 2050, that's clear. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a Clean Planet for All communication. We wouldn't have to have a long-term strategy. We'd just say, that's it, 2030 is also 2050, which it's not. But it does give an excellent starting point for working towards 2050. First, on electricity market design, the whole package, I think, is very good. We have all sorts of new provisions to make consumers more active, to use demand response, to better integrate renewables into the system, better risk preparedness, etc. So that's already a very good base. What could be done in the next commission, and it's up to them to decide, not me or indeed any of us in this room, is something similar in the gas sector, to move forward on decarbonization of gas, to improve, if necessary, the regulatory framework for gas in the future. Because for us, gas will certainly have an important role in the short term to substitute for coal and to offset the variability of renewables. But in the medium to long term, it also has to decarbonize, and some of you have mentioned some ways in which this can be done. So that's one part of the 2030 package. And the other, I think, that's very important is, of course, these targets for 32% renewables, 32.5% energy efficiency, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive updated, and the most important, from my perspective, of course, is the governance regulation. You will have seen that yesterday the Commission adopted a communication, 28 recommendations on each of the draft national plans that the member states have submitted, and 30 staff working papers, one for each member state, plus 2 technical ones. And these show that in order to reach the 2030 targets, member states still need to do more in their final plans. And so these recommendations are intended to give an extra push to member states to improve their plans in the final version. So as I said, it's a good baseline. It should help us move in the right direction, but there's still more to be done. And a couple of areas that the plans themselves need to do more on is the long-term strategy at national level, first, and second, on research and innovation. European technology and innovation and research is very good, but it's an area where I would say most of the member states did not how can I say this diplomatically? Well, I won't be diplomatic. Robustly and thoroughly and extensively fill out that part. And that's an area where I think in the future, and it's significant for the next multi-annual financial framework too, where a big push on research has been given. That's an area too where that could be improved.
Thank you very much. If I may immediately follow up on what you just said, decarbonizing gas. Could you say something more about it? What are examples of decarbonized gas and how
well,
can we
the
do
use
this?
of power. Well, I'm supposed to say power to X now, which it sounds a bit like X-Files, but instead of power to gas, using excess renewables that are not integrated to the grid to create hydrogen. There's a very good example. The technical people know all sorts of new and better ways of doing this. And I don't want to put my foot in the wrong spot, but there are lots of ways of decarbonizing gas. And one element that has been identified in the Clean Planet for All communication is, of course, the use of carbon capture and storage as one element to offset the residual CO2 emissions that can't be done through other means.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. William Tots from Transport and Environment. William, if I may ask you, car manufacturers, was already mentioned by Pete in the introduction as well, seem to be looking increasingly at electrification and EVs, especially where it comes to light-duty vehicles. We see some progress there. Do you think this is the right way forward for a net zero strategy in that sector? But maybe also looking beyond heavier duty transports, trucks, buses, but I guess also aviation and maritime. Do you see electrification playing there as well, or are there certain limitations to that? Thank you.
Thanks, Dries. I guess the challenge that we have ahead of us is to meet the 2030 goals, which are the law, in a way that we can achieve our 2050 goals. And I think that's, and I'm referring to what Pete said in his introduction, we need to avoid a number of solutions. We need to focus on the things that are scalable and that are going to be beneficial in the long run. And I think there, zero-emission technology, in particular battery electrification for the light-duty sector, is the key way forward. If you look at the manufacturing sector in Europe, something has changed in the last 3-4 years. And I think it's a combination of Dieselgate, the Chinese EV mandate, the rise of Tesla, and then, of course, the European regulations on CO2 for cars. And so I think in the boards of Renault, Daimler, Volkswagen, there are now really a group of people that is genuinely committed to transform the industry. And that is why, in total, we are seeing commitments to invest more than 100 billion euros in electrification in the next 5, 6, 7 years. So that is huge. But I think we should also not get carried away. This is still, to a large extent, a compliance market. It is a market that is driven by regulation, by European regulation. And the challenge that we have ahead of us in the next years is to move the manufacturing industry, the car makers, away from a compliance mindset into a market-making mindset. And that means that you do not try to sell exactly as many electric cars as are needed to hit your CO2 targets, but that you try to sell as many as you can. And that means that you start investing in infrastructure yourself as a manufacturer, that you take responsibility for that, because that's one of the key challenges, that you start changing your advertising. And I think we're slowly seeing this happening with companies like Volkswagen, Renault, Daimler. I think the job is not done, though. And as policymakers, and in the next years, I hope the Commission will continue on the same track and will be even more clear than it has been in the past. We need to be very clear to manufacturers that the direction is zero emission. So, if we see the Netherlands, France, the UK announce an ICE phase out of combustion vehicles, beyond combustion, as Pete Harrison said, I think that is very valuable. 2, we need to move forward on taxation. 3, infrastructure. We need a big investment plan in Europe to build the infrastructure, because if we want to go to market shares of 10, 20, 30%, you need to go beyond the people that have their own house and their own parking garage. That's quite clear. So I think if we do these things, we're actually in a pretty good position today to move from market shares of new vehicle sales from 2% to 10, 15, perhaps more percent in 2025. That is completely inadequate in light of the 2050 challenge, but it gives you basically the critical mass from a manufacturing perspective to move to the higher shares that are needed 2030, 2035. Now, if you look at the other sectors, clearly there's a number of challenges that you have with trucks and planes and ships that you don't have with light-duty vehicles. For example, you need to take off in the air. However, fundamentally, decarbonizing these modes also requires electricity. If you look at the shipping sector, hydrogen and ammonia are often mentioned as the key technologies or fuels. If you look at the trucking sector, it's hydrogen, battery electrification, catenary overhead wires. And for aviation, which is arguably the hardest to abate sector, it is based on today's technology, a combination of a limited amount of advanced biofuels, and I really agree that we need to be careful with biofuels, bioenergy, and the heavy lifting will have to come from electrofuels. And all of these technologies are based on electricity. So I think, and I will end there, it remains, it's as true as it was 10 years ago that the cornerstone of decarbonizing our economy is the electricity sector.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask you something else? I was recently at a presentation from Equinor, the Norwegian company, who was showing a slide that the demand for batteries in EVs will increase in China, globally, in Europe as well, but that the production capacity of batteries is actually not going to be sufficient to supply that demand. Is that something that TNE has looked at as well? Do you have a perspective on that? Is Europe going to be part of that chain?
I mean, it's already interesting that we're moving away from a debate where car makers say that there's no demand for their vehicles to a debate where they say, well, we cannot supply them fast enough. So I think that's actually progress. We will be publishing a report in the next month where we look at this question in a lot of detail, and we've got data from IHS, which is sort of the best marketing consultancy in the automotive sector. And if you look at battery manufacturing capacity that is planned in the next years, there will be enough. That is not going to be the problem.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Mr. Sainz here on my left. Your company, Iberdrola, is a champion in renewables and smart energy solutions, I can say. What is your vision on the Commission's proposal of achieving net zero European economy? Do you think it's feasible? And do you see it as an opportunity as well? I think you actually wanted to present a slide, so please, yeah.
Just this slide. So thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to share with you 3 ideas. The first one is that electricity, as it was mentioned, is the main driver to transform the energy system needed to tackle climate change. Iberdrola is a traditional power utility that nearly 2 decades ago, we understood that for many reasons, the energy transition based on renewable energies and energy efficiency was needed. So, and what started as a minor trend has become really unstoppable. Scenarios of 100% renewables in the electricity sector that were considered impossible only 10 years ago, today are viable from a technical and economical point of view. And not only viable, but also desirable in terms of growth, jobs, energy independency, health, and environment. So, as it was mentioned, moving towards an electricity sector with a very high penetration of renewables has 2 fundamental advantages. The first one is that electricity can play a key role to decarbonize other sectors, so transport, building, industry, even industry. And the second is that electricity not only implies clean energy, but a much more efficient energy use, which will improve the efficiency of the entire system. With this, it is now possible to achieve the 3 objectives of the energy trilemma: sustainable, secure, and competitive energy. So this strategic approach is behind our explicit support to the net zero emission goal and to those policy and technologies pathways that are aligned. The second idea is that with the current technologies, this is important, with the current technologies, it's economically viable to start a rapid and deep decarbonization. So we have plenty of levers with the current technologies that we have to take advantage of in the short term. Penetration of renewables in the electricity sector. Our analysis in Iberdrola shows that the economic optimal share of renewables penetration in Spain will be around 80% in 2030. I'm talking about economically optimal share. So we also have electrification, as was mentioned by William, electrification of light and short-range transport. And also energy efficient solutions through end uses. We have LED, heat pumps in buildings, more efficient electric motors in industry. So given the technological revolution being brought about by clean energies, renewables, but also batteries efficiency, it is economically feasible to achieve an 80% reduction of emissions by 2050 with current technologies. Nonetheless, of course, this will require greater efforts in energy efficiency, the transition to a circular economy, and the full rollout of some of the technologies that have now reached a high level of maturity. For instance, renewable, wind, and solar photovoltaic in the electricity sector. However, moving from 80% to a CO2 neutrality by 2050 will require technologies and measures that are as yet undeveloped and which are currently very costly and have low efficiency rates. So I'm talking about CCS, natural-based solutions, green hydrogen and biogases. And also, and this is important, a change in some of our behaviors as citizens and consumers. All these changes represent important challenges that can be overcome with the right policies and the right commitments. But despite those challenges, Iberdrola supports the goal of achieving a net zero emissions European economy by 2050, convinced as it is of the technical and economic feasibility and the opportunities presented by this scenario. I would like to make a special mention to the industry. The EU is initially well positioned to take advantage of the economic opportunities of this scenario. So we have natural resources, we have leading companies, but we are in a process of global competition. And if we do not take advantage of it, others will. And the third and last message is that we have to adapt the current policies to this new context. So to make the most of these economic and industrial opportunities, we need, of course, medium and long-term objectives, 2030 and 2050, policies to meet these goals. I fully agree with the idea of taxes. So we need environmental tax reform based on the polluter pays principle and freeing the electricity tariff from charges that do not correspond to it to ensure a real technological neutrality and a level playing field required for the most efficient options to be developed. Maybe we can talk later about the role of consumers, because now there is competition between energies for transport, for cooling, and what we need is the right price signals. So we also need, of course, industrial policies, industrial strategies. We need to analyze opportunities, threats, competitive advantage, and setting out intelligent strategies, information and public awareness to take advantage of these opportunities. Of course, fair transition policies to ensure that the affected sectors are given a reasonable period in which to adapt. And of course, research and development policies targeting the development of cutting-edge, valuable technologies for the near future. Just a concluding remark, we are facing a unique economic and environmental opportunity that we cannot fail to take. Now is the time to adopt robust and smart frameworks. We should engage with this new industrial revolution with respect to which we are very well positioned and able to take advantage of its opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sainz. Maybe just an immediate question to your presentation. I think you were referring to a tax shift away from electricity, if I got that right. Away from electricity would mean towards something else. Would that be then the fossil fuels? And if so, what is the impact going to be on, let's say, energy bills from consumers right away? And will consumers have enough opportunities to actually avoid the tax increase by moving to electricity? Or will there be a transition period to manage in terms of energy bills?
Of course, we need a transition period. But what we need is an environmental tax reform that reflects the cost of the different energies considering environmental cost. And when we talk about environmental cost, CO2 is a key element, but also pollution of the air pollution is key. And of course, this will mean a change in the relative prices of electricity, and gas, and oil. But the point today is that there are some energies that are paying, or some consumers that are paying for CO2 and also for renewables, for instance, electricity consumers, and oil consumers are not paying for CO2 and renewables. And this is creating distortions. And now, those distortions that in the past were not so important, today are very important because there is competition between different energies. And what we need is to avoid these distortions with this reform that, of course, will have to be gradually. But we need messages, and prices are key for consumers.
Thank you very much. That brings us to our last speaker, Mr. Martin Porter from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Martin, CSL represents a large group of corporate leaders that are supportive of the Net Zero 2050 goals, including some of the energy-intensive industries. What are the solutions for these energy-intensive sectors, the more harder to abate sectors, as they are called to? Are we also looking at clean technologies that are available and becoming cheaper, or is the situation different there than in the power sector?
Thank you, Dries. Well, I think maybe by way of introduction, when we talk about these sectors being hard to abate, that may have been true 5 or 10 years ago. Actually, we now understand much more what the possibilities and potential is for cement, steel, resource and energy intensive industries collectively. And whilst it's not necessarily easy, because there are many challenges involved in moving from one system to another, they're not necessarily harder than other parts of the economy, given the scale of the challenge that we have. And as you said, the CSL has established a number of platforms, one of which focuses specifically on climate change. And indeed, one of the members of that group is Iberdrola. And these are a group of companies that combine a commitment on their own account to undertake to decarbonize, to move to a net zero corporate strategy, but also who are supportive publicly of the move for the economy as a whole in Europe to net zero. Those two things go hand in hand, of course, because companies who have a significant public presence, who have a well-known brand, are able not only to talk to citizens, their consumers, but also have an impact on the creation of new markets in a way which smaller companies, maybe acting individually, cannot. And these companies, therefore, have undertaken a series of activities. On the one hand, specifically related to energy, many of them are now purchasing renewable power themselves in order to stimulate not only their own activities, but the demand for renewable electricity, amongst other things. So they can help create demand for renewable energy. But they also obviously are working to try to create a policy environment that supports the transition of all of those companies and many more beyond. And if I then turn to the companies that historically have not been part of this group, because the majority of the group have been those seeking to provide the solutions at the leading end, like Iberdrola of the energy transition. Now we're looking more at resource and energy intensive industries that have been, in policy terms at least, dealt with largely historically through the emissions trading system. There is now much greater interest, which we can witness beyond the CSL platforms, of those industrial sectors not only to take seriously the net zero challenge per se, and I think we can see individual trade associations as well as individual companies now in those sectors committing to that goal, but also undertaking activities themselves which demonstrate that this is achievable. Amongst those, clearly, a shift from the heat and the power that they need to come more from electrification is absolutely central to this transition. So if there's an important message here, I guess, it's that the energy transition has to be considered alongside an industrial transition, and in policy terms and in corporate terms, operated together. That is something that is starting to happen, but has more progress to make. If we look at the improvements that those industries have made over recent years, and they have made significant improvements, much of it has come from efficiency improvements. They will reach the end of their course of possibilities before too long. You can only improve technical efficiencies to such a point where the gains are no longer significant, and therefore we will start to move to both more innovative process technology improvements, and in particular you can see new technologies now which have been latent but coming to the fore, certainly in areas like steel, cement and chemicals, but also a much greater emphasis on demand reduction policies. So demand reduction of resources as well as energy, and hence the role of the circular economy becoming significant for those companies with respect to how they use resources efficiently, how they think about their business models, and how therefore they contribute to solving both, if you want, waste and resource questions as well as climate. And the conclusion, I think, from that is that they are looking, I think much as others have said, for a policy approach which strategically integrates industrial and energy priorities. The systems need to be understood as connected, obviously, and therefore the industrial strategy that Gonzalo mentioned, targeting new industries and how they connect to this, will require an approach that also tackles investment and innovation, competition and trade-related topics, as well as those which we're more familiar with, and indeed a link back into the single market, I suspect. So the use of standards to create the new markets and drive demand for these very low carbon products in due course. So there's a set of issues here that link energy to industry and indeed wider market evolution, which these companies now, both resource and energy intensive and those in other parts of the value chain, are very invested in.
Excellent, thank you very much. So is CISL looking at border tax adjustments and thinking of enforcing climate action through trade and its demand leverage that we have as Europeans?
Well, I think CISL is looking at that, but only as part of a portfolio of possible responses to how to mitigate any potential competitive disadvantage from this transition. It is one of the possibilities, but we also see others. And I mentioned the way that standards in the single market could potentially be developed in such a way as to drive demand, but without immediately having a recourse to border adjustment measures. The way the ETS currently operates, there are compensatory mechanisms within that, which also would need to be considered in relation to any border tax adjustment. And therefore, the two need to be considered at the same time. One may be a trade-off for the other. But there are other ways in which public investment and public policy can try to find ways to compensate for competitive disadvantage, one of which is border adjustment mechanisms, but not the only one.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, but thank you very much for the interesting contributions. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I don't think there's a microphone going around, but I suggest you could stand up and raise your voice if you want. Oh, there is indeed a microphone that makes it... plenty of microphones. It's full of microphones. I see 1, 2. I'm going to try to keep it to 3 because I'm conscious of time. 1, 2. Anybody wants the last opportunity? No? Okay. So first the lady closer to me and then the person in the back here. Can you please let us know who you work for, your name and... Yeah. thing. I think people were referring to fossil fuel combustion mostly, but yeah, point taken. Second person in the back. Yep. You don't have a microphone?
There are microphones in the chairs. If you
Yeah.
open your chair, there's a microphone in the armrest of your chair. And there's a button you can
But not at the very back. Those are the extras. Those are the extras. I think the chair's at the back, though.
So if you're pushing the button in your chair, there's a microphone you could use.
Better like this. Can everyone hear me? All right. So I'm a student at the TU Delft in the Netherlands. I'm here for Yes Europe. It's a network for young energy professionals in Europe. And my question to the speakers is about critical raw materials, because I am very happy to hear that we need to electrify and that we need to consume a lot of renewable energy. I'm just curious to hear how they reflect on the material base that we need to construct all the technologies we will need to generate all this renewable electricity.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
question. Okay, I'm going to leave it to this, and I'm going to give everybody actually an opportunity to respond to the two questions. Well, one question and one more statement. Mrs. Richards, could I start with you? One question around hydrogen and combustion, and another one around the raw
Yes.
materials.
Well, let's say on combustion engines, there's nothing in any of the Commission text you will have seen that says combustion engines have to disappear. What we say is we have to move towards net zero. So how you do that and under what circumstances and what scenario is what is important. So combustion engines, of course, would continue if they continue to use hydrogen. And you will have seen in the long-term strategy the different scenarios. One of them is using hydrogen at a much higher rate, of course, in combustion engines, and especially for heavy transport and others. But none of those individual scenarios, and this includes electrification, super electrification, none of those individual scenarios on their own would allow us to get to net zero, at least according to our modeling, which is not to say that increased electrification is not good. Of course it is, and it should be pushed. But then, of course, we have to think also about infrastructure, interconnections, cybersecurity. You've seen what happened in Paraguay and, not Paraguay, Argentina, well, it was also affected Paraguay, Argentina and Uruguay on the weekend. So we have to make sure that it's a robust and good system. And then on critical raw materials, of course, this is a very important element too, and I am convinced that there will be all sorts of new technologies that will develop. The steel industry is looking at these, cement industry is looking at these. I know you're talking probably about the batteries for electric vehicles, but I suspect there'll be all sorts of new solutions, and these, of course, have to be addressed too.
Thank you. I'm going to follow the line, and I'm going to ask you to be really short. Apologies.
Okay, really short. On the fuels, we get that a lot from the car industry and the truck industry. Why do you force us towards electrification? We can just decarbonize the fuel. I disagree with that, because if you would do the modeling and you would try to decarbonize the entire fuel system on the basis of synthetic fuels or biofuels, you would find that this is very inefficient, very expensive, and it's actually not sustainable to do that. So these types of fuel, you only want to use them where you have absolutely no alternative, and that's aviation. So I think the Commission should actually be more clear and tell manufacturers the direction is zero emission. On raw materials, yes, zero emission vehicles. Yeah, it's yes. Yeah. On raw materials. Yes, it is a good point. Yeah, we don't have. Okay, we have a bit of lithium in Europe. We don't have a lot of cobalt in Europe. But you need to not forget that we are in a position of extreme dependence today. We import almost all of our oil from places like Russia, the Middle East, and actually moving towards a dependence on lithium and cobalt has, compared to that dependence, has a number of benefits. Because oil, you burn it constantly. You don't burn your batteries. You actually use them for quite a number of years. You recharge them, and then once you can't use them anymore, you can recycle them. And I don't think you can do that with oil. So I think actually this is, it doesn't solve all the problems we have in the world, but it's a big improvement.
Martin.
I'll just comment on the critical raw materials point. I think the first thing to say is that is a topic which has to be part of this integrated industrial strategy approach. And indeed, in the discussions which are progressing that the Commission is facilitating at the moment, they are absolutely part of that, which is a good thing. And the response to the potential problem, because as you say, it's we have some dependencies already. We don't want to shift to another set of dependencies which are more problematic in their own right. But we come back again and again to how efficiently we use resources and the way that a more circular economy will facilitate the use of those critical raw materials in a more effective way. We're still not good enough at retaining the value of all the materials, including those critical raw materials, particularly if we want the type of industrial value chains to develop that are located in Europe. So the circular economy comes back again as part of the answer to that problem.
Thank you. Last word from Mr.
Okay,
Sainz.
just to mention on hydrogen, on CCS, on green hydrogen or biogases, what I say is that those technologies are going to be needed, but with the current technologies, we can go to reduce 80% of the emissions, and those technologies are ready today. So, I think that what we have to do is to move very quickly and to move very deeply in this decarbonization in the next 10 years, and I have mentioned a lot of opportunities, renewables, and in 10 years, we will see the competitiveness of these options. And once these options demonstrate their competitiveness, there will be different options, and we will see. But for us, the message is that this is a more medium-term issue, and in the short term, what we have to do is to move forward, because we are not moving forward with the necessary speed, because the later we act, the more costly and the more complex will be the process.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Could I ask a round of applause for the panelists, please? Don't run away, stay where you are, because I'm going to hand over to Michael from Smartend for the second panel, and I'm sure that will be as exciting, at least as exciting as this one. Michael, I'll give you the... Yeah.